Before sunset, Khalid ibn al-Walid had broken 9 swords. Not 1, not 2, 9.
And when the battle finally ended, only 1 blade remained in his hand. This is not a legend someone added later to make the story bigger. It is Khalid's own words, preserved in one of the most carefully verified hadith collections that exists. The battle that would destroy 9 swords is the same battle that gave him the name history would never let go of. A name spoken not by a crowd and not by Khalid himself, but by the Prophet from 100 miles away before the battle had even ended.
We left Khalid in the last chapter walking into Medina as one of 3 ordinary converts. No rank, no history fighting on this side of anything. Within weeks, everything changed. This is the story of Mu'tah. It started with a murdered envoy. The Prophet had sent a man named al-Harith ibn Umayr to carry a letter to a Byzantine allied governor in Greater Syria. Al-Harith was seized and beheaded on the order of Shurabil ibn Amr, a Ghassanid governor loyal to the Byzantine Empire. Killing a messenger was, across nearly every code of conduct in the ancient world, one of the gravest violations imaginable. When the news reached Medina, it was treated for exactly what it was, a declaration of war. The Prophet mobilized 3,000 men. Before the army even left Medina, he named 3 commanders in order. Zayd ibn Harithah would lead, a freed slave the Prophet had adopted as his own son. If Zayd fell, Ja'far ibn Abi Talib would take the banner, the Prophet's own cousin, recently returned from years of leading refugees in Abyssinia. If Ja'far fell, Abdullah ibn Rawahah would take it after him. Everyone understood why. This mission might not return. Khalid was not one of the 3 names. He was simply one of the 3,000, a recent convert with a formidable reputation and no command structure built around him yet. Whatever happened next, it did not happen because Khalid was already in charge. When the army reached the territory east of the Jordan River, they learned the scale of what was waiting for them. The earliest authentic reports describe an enemy force vastly larger than their own, though the specific numbers that get repeated, sometimes as high as 100,000, are treated with real skepticism by historians today. The kind of round, overwhelming figure ancient sources reached for to convey scale rather than an actual headcount. What every version of the story agrees on is simpler and just as staggering. 3,000 men were about to face a force that outnumbered them by an enormous margin, on ground far from home, against an empire that had held this frontier for centuries. The commanders debated turning back for reinforcements, or at least sending word to the Prophet and waiting for further instruction. Abdullah ibn Rawahah stood and reminded them why they had marched out in the first place. They had not come this far chasing certainty, he told them. Numbers had never been what carried them to victory before, at Badr or anywhere else. Whatever happened next, win or fall, would be a form of victory either way, by the reckoning that had brought them out of Medina in the first place. So they marched on, toward Mu'tah. Along the way, the column passed near a village whose people fired arrows into their rear, wounding several men and killing one. Some soldiers wanted to turn aside and settle the matter first. Zayd refused. The larger confrontation was still waiting ahead, and he would not let a smaller one pull them off course. It was the Muslims themselves, in the end, who chose the open plain at Mu'tah as their ground, rather than being cornered into it. The 2 armies met in a valley between 2 high points of ground, narrow enough to blunt some of the Byzantine advantage, not narrow enough to erase it. Zayd ibn Harithah took the banner first,
and led the charge directly into the enemy line. He fell. The man the prophet had once called his own son, the first to test whether a succession plan built for the worst case would actually hold. It held. The banner did not touch the ground.
Ja'far ibn Abi Talib picked up the banner next, the prophet's own cousin, now holding the flag in the middle of a battle that had just lost its chief commander, with the enemy pressing harder by the minute. Accounts describe him fighting until both of his arms were severed and pressing the banner against his chest with what remained of them rather than let it touch the ground. 50 wounds, every single one on the front of his body, none on his back. He never turned away. Abdullah ibn Rawahah took the banner third, exactly as the prophet had instructed before they left Medina. He fought on horseback, reciting verses of resolve to the men around him, the same man whose speech had convinced the army to march forward instead of turning back. Then he fell too. 3 commanders, one after another. Exactly as planned. Exactly as feared. It is worth pausing on what this frontier actually meant. Muta sat on the edge of Byzantine territory, in the region of Greater Syria the empire had held, in one form or another, for centuries, backed by the wealth, the administration, and the military tradition of one of the 2 great powers of the age. This was not a raid on a rival tribe. It was a direct challenge, deliberate or not, to that power. On ground, it had never seriously expected anyone from Arabia to contest. 3,000 men marching into that frontier were not expecting an easy fight. They were expecting, at best, a costly one, and what they found waiting for them was worse than that. The army began to waver. A man named Thabit ibn al-Arqam picked up the fallen banner, not to claim command, but to hold the line long enough for the army to choose someone. They chose Khalid ibn al-Walid, a man who had been in Medina for weeks, who had no history commanding Muslim forces, no battles fought on this side of the line, no track record anyone in that army had personally witnessed. Every soldier still standing on that field had just watched 3 of the most trusted men in their community die, one after another. And in that moment, with the enemy still in front of them and no time to deliberate, they handed their only remaining chance of survival to the newest man among them, handed a falling banner in the middle of a battle already lost. It is worth remembering here what these same soldiers could not have fully known, that this was the same mind that had once read a battlefield at Uhud in seconds from the opposing side and turned a Muslim victory into a rout. Whatever instinct had made him dangerous as an enemy was about to be aimed for the first time at getting his own side out alive. Through the darkness that followed, men silently changed positions. Front lines became rear lines. Rear lines moved forward as if fresh and unused. New banners appeared where the enemy could see them, planted in formations arranged to look like an army twice its real size, though not a single new soldier had actually arrived. By the time the sun came up, the Byzantine commanders were staring across the field at a force that seemed impossibly to have grown overnight, and they hesitated. That hesitation was the whole plan. In that pause, bought entirely by nerve and formation, Khalid pulled the entire remaining army out of a battle it had no path to winning outright. He kept skirmishing at the edges, just enough to cover the retreat, never enough to risk another full engagement. This is where the 9th sword finally gave out. 9 swords broken in a single day, in one man's hand, while he was simultaneously reading the battlefield, directing a deception, and organizing an entire army's escape. Blade after blade, presumably each one functional enough to be drawn into the fight in the first place, failing under the sheer duration and intensity of close combat, until only a single Yemeni blade remained. His own account of it, preserved in Sahih al-Bukhari, one of the most rigorously authenticated hadith collections in the entire tradition, is almost clinical. 9 swords broke in my hand. Nothing added, no boast. Back in Medina, before any messenger had physically arrived, the Prophet gathered his companions and described what was happening at Mu'tah as it happened, 100 miles away, through a means none of them could fully explain. Zayd falling, then Ja'far, then Abdullah. Those present recorded that something like joy showed in his expression, even as he described 3 deaths, because in the same breath, he told them the 3 had been raised to his own place in paradise. And then he added something else. A sword from the swords of Allah had taken up the banner, and God had granted victory through his hands. That line, spoken in real time, is the authentic root of the title history remembers. It is worth being precise about it. The exact formal epithet many people know today as a fixed title bestowed in one ceremonial moment is attested more explicitly in compilations written a few centuries later. What is solidly authentic, preserved in Bukhari itself, is this description, spoken on the very day the battle unfolded, before Khalid had even returned home. The title as it's remembered today grew from that root. Getting that sequence right doesn't make the moment smaller, it makes it more remarkable. Not a title handed over in a throne room, a description spoken about a man watching a battle collapse and refusing to let it become a massacre. When the army reached the outskirts of Medina, something happened that rarely makes it into the more triumphant retellings. Word had traveled ahead of them. 3 of the community's most beloved men were dead, and the army was returning without the kind of clear, decisive victory a homecoming crowd wanted to see. Some people, seeing the soldiers return without the 3 commanders who had marched out with them, threw dust in their faces. "Runaways," they shouted. "You fled the cause of God." The Prophet stepped in, publicly. "They are not runaways," he said. "They are those who return to fight again." Some traditions preserve the line as a short, deliberate pairing in Arabic, al-farar against al-qarar, fleeing set directly against returning. It didn't fully settle the matter. One soldier from the expedition, Salama ibn Hisham, avoided the mosque for a period afterward, unwilling to face the accusation, even with the Prophet's own defense on record. It took further battles before the reputations of the men who survived Mu'tah were fully restored in the eyes of their own community. In the same homecoming, Ja'far's young son was carried on the Prophet's own arm, a small human moment set right beside the shouting. The title Khalid carried out of Mu'tah did not arrive wrapped in celebration. It arrived next to real doubt, shouted in the street, about whether this had been a defeat wearing a different name. Quick word before we continue. Getting a battle like this right means checking the earliest reports against everything that got added to the story later. The exaggerations, the round numbers, the details that only show up centuries after the fact. If that kind of care matters to you, consider supporting the channel as a member. Thank you to everyone already doing that. This series exists because of you. Muslim casualties that day are traditionally counted at around 12 men, a strikingly small number given the size of the force they faced, and given that they were, by the end, executing a retreat rather than a rout, under a commander none of them had fought beside before that day.
An army that size, facing that kind of numerical disadvantage against imperial forces on their own frontier, does not typically walk away mostly intact, unless someone in command did something unusual. That number alone tells you the maneuver worked, whatever the crowd throwing dust believed when they saw the army come home.
So here is where Muta actually leaves Khalid. Not as a conqueror. The battle was not a conquest, and no honest account of it pretends otherwise. Not as an unambiguous hero turning to parades. Some of his own neighbors called him a coward to his face in the street, within earshot of the very men who had just fought their way out of an impossible position beside him. Men who owed their lives to the decision he had made overnight. What he carried out instead was a line spoken by the prophet himself, from 100 miles away, before he even knew the full details of what had happened. A sword from the swords of Allah, and an army that came home mostly alive because a man with no command experience, handed a falling banner in a collapsing battle, didn't try to be a hero. He tried to get his men out. There is something worth sitting with in how little Khalid himself seems to have said about his own role afterward. The hadith that survives from him is not a boast. It is a simple, almost clinical accounting. 9 swords broke in my hand. Nothing dramatic added. No claim to have single-handedly saved the day. No account of his own thinking in the moment. No description of fear or resolve. The praise attached to the moment came from the prophet's mouth, not his own. The criticism, from the crowd throwing dust, came from people who had every reason to expect a different kind of homecoming, after 3 of their community's most beloved men did not come home at all. Between those 2 reactions, praise he didn't ask for and blame he didn't argue against, Khalid himself is almost silent in the record. Whatever he thought about that day, he mostly kept to himself. 9 swords broke doing it. 3 fallen commanders, 1 impossible retreat, and a title history would never forget. What came next for Khalid, once Mecca itself finally fell and the door opened to campaigns far larger than a single desperate withdrawal in Byzantine territory, is where this series goes next. If you want authentic Islamic history without the exaggeration, subscribe. Next time, we follow Khalid into the conquest of Mecca.